The deputy told him to step off the porch, and for a moment, Raymond Stokes didn't understand the words. This was his porch, his house, the same house he'd carried his wife across the threshold of in 1971, the year he came home from Vietnam with shrapnel still working its way out of his left shoulder. But the deputy had a hand on his holster, and there was a second cruiser pulling up the gravel drive, and somewhere in Raymond's 81-year-old mind, a switch flipped. He'd seen that look before. Men with weapons who'd already decided you were the enemy. So he stepped off his porch. That was the first mistake, though he wouldn't understand why for another 6 weeks. Wouldn't understand that the moment his boots hit the dirt of his own front yard, he'd crossed an invisible line that would cost him nearly everything he had left. The property sat on 11 acres outside Carthage, Texas. Not much to look at if you were passing through. A faded blue farmhouse with a tin roof that sang in the rain. A barn that hadn't held livestock in 20 years. A creek that ran dry in August and flooded in March. Raymond had lived there for 52 years, paid off the mortgage in 1994, buried his wife Della under the pecan tree out back in 2019. And now, according to the papers the deputy handed him, he no longer owned any of it. The document was dense with legal language Raymond couldn't parse. Something about a tax sale. Something about a notice sent to an address he'd never lived at. Something about a company called Eastbrook Holdings, LLC, having purchased the property for $4,200 at a county auction held the previous October. Raymond tried to explain, tried to say there must be a mistake. He'd paid his taxes every year, same as he'd done since Johnson was president. Drove down to the county office himself every January with a check, because he didn't trust the mail and didn't trust computers. The deputy wasn't unkind, just tired. He said Raymond would need to take it up with the court, said there was nothing he could do, said if Raymond went back inside that house, he'd be subject to arrest for criminal trespassing. Criminal trespassing. In the house where he'd taught his son to walk, where he'd held Della's hand through 3 miscarriages before they finally had Thomas, where he'd sat on that very porch the night they got the call about Thomas's helicopter going down in Fallujah. Raymond stood in his front yard as the sun went down. He had nowhere to go. His truck was parked beside the barn, but his wallet was inside the house. His medication was inside the house. The photo of Della on their wedding day, the one he talked to every morning, was inside the house. He slept in the truck that night. November in East Texas isn't forgiving, and Raymond's blood had thinned with age. He woke before dawn with his joints screaming and a tightness in his chest that might have been his heart or might have been grief. By then, he couldn't tell the difference. The county clerk's office opened at 8. Raymond was waiting at the door by 7. What he learned in the next 2 hours would have broken a younger man. In 2022, Panola County had switched to a new property tax system. Digital records, automated notices, all very modern. Somewhere in the transition, Raymond's address had been entered incorrectly. His tax notices for the past 2 years had been sent to 1847 Rural Route 6. He lived at 1874 Rural Route 6. The numbers had been transposed by a clerk who'd already moved to Louisiana and couldn't be reached. Raymond had continued paying his taxes. He had the canceled checks to prove it. But the payments had been applied to the wrong parcel, to a vacant lot 3 miles away that nobody had claimed in a decade. Meanwhile, his property, the property where he'd lived for half a century, was flagged as delinquent. Notices were sent to the wrong address and returned. A sale was scheduled. Eastbrook Holdings, LLC, a company registered to an address in Delaware, had purchased Raymond's home and land for less than the cost of a used car. By the time Raymond understood what had happened, his home had been owned by strangers for 93 days. The clerk was sympathetic, genuinely apologetic, but she explained that she had no authority to undo a tax sale. That would require a court order. Raymond would need to file a petition. He would need to prove the county had failed in its duty to notify him. He would need to do it within the statutory window, which closed in 4 months. She gave him a list of legal aid organizations. Most weren't taking new clients. One had a 6-month waiting list. Another only handled cases in Harris County, 200 miles away. Raymond walked out of that office with a stack of papers he couldn't afford to file and a deadline he didn't know how to meet. He tried calling Eastbrook Holdings. The number on their corporate registration went to a voicemail that was full. He tried the registered agent in Delaware, got a recording that said they only accepted communication in writing. He sent a letter, return receipt requested. It came back 3 weeks later, marked refused. Meanwhile, he was living in his truck. The VA clinic in Marshall saw him twice, gave him a 30-day supply of his heart medication, and asked if he had somewhere safe to stay. He lied and said yes. Pride is a strange thing. It doesn't keep you warm, but sometimes it's all you have left. The first lawsuit arrived on December 8th. Eastbrook Holdings LLC versus Raymond Eugene Stokes, filed in the 123rd District Court, Panola County. The complaint alleged that Raymond had unlawfully entered the property on November 2nd, 4th, 7th, and 12th, that he had removed personal items from the residence, that he had caused damage to a door lock, that he had threatened and intimidated representatives of the lawful owner. They were asking for $50,000 in damages, plus legal fees, plus an injunction barring Raymond from coming within 500 feet of his own home. Raymond read the complaint 3 times before the words made sense, and then he sat in the parking lot of the Carthage Public Library, where he'd gone to use the computers, and he felt something cold settle into his chest. The items he'd removed were his insulin and his blood pressure medication. The damage to the lock had been a stuck deadbolt he'd forced open because he was shaking from low blood sugar. The representatives he'd threatened were 2 men in a black SUV who'd driven up while he was getting his pills and told him to get off the property before they called the law. He hadn't threatened anyone. He just asked them what gave them the right. Apparently, that was enough. The preliminary hearing was set for January 15th. Raymond had no lawyer. He'd called the legal aid organizations again. One said they might be able to help if he could wait until March. Another said tax sale cases weren't in their wheelhouse. A third said they only represented people who were currently housed. Raymond was currently living in a Walmart parking lot, moving his truck every few hours so security wouldn't run him off. He didn't mention that to anyone. The one person he did call was his younger brother, Carl, who lived outside Oklahoma City. Carl was 76 and had his own troubles, a wife with dementia, medical bills that were eating through their savings. But he wired Raymond $500 and told him to find a lawyer, any lawyer, and fight. The money lasted 2 weeks. It went to gas, food, a motel room for 3 nights when the temperature dropped to 19 degrees. Raymond spent hours in the library, teaching himself how to file a motion, how to request a continuance, how to navigate a court system designed for people with law degrees and steady addresses. He filed his own petition to void the tax sale on January 3rd, handwritten, because he couldn't afford to print anything. He cited cases he'd found online. He attached copies of his canceled checks. He wrote, in language that was plain and honest and probably all wrong, that he had lived on that property for 52 years and had never missed a payment, and had never been properly notified that his home was being sold out from under him. The court clerk accepted the filing. She didn't look hopeful. January 15th came hard and cold, the kind of gray morning that makes old bones feel older. Raymond put on his only suit, the one he'd worn to Della's funeral. It hung off him now. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. The 123rd District Court was housed in a building that smelled of dust and floor wax. The judge was a woman named Margaret Holloway, 60-something, with reading glasses that she kept pushing up her nose. Eastbrook Holdings was represented by a young attorney from Dallas named Kyle Vanderhorn. Raymond represented himself. Vanderhorn went first. He was polished, confident. He described Raymond as a bitter former owner who refused to accept the lawful transfer of property. He presented photographs of Raymond's truck parked on the road outside the property. He presented a statement from one of the men in the SUV claiming Raymond had said, and this was a quote, that they'd have to kill him before he gave up his home. Raymond didn't remember saying that. He didn't remember most of that conversation, but it sounded like something he might say. It sounded true. When it was Raymond's turn to speak, he stood slowly. His left leg had been giving him trouble, the one where the shrapnel had nicked a nerve in 1970. He felt every eye in that courtroom on him, felt the weight of a system he'd never understood and never trusted. He told them about Vietnam, about coming home to a country that didn't want him, about Della, who did, about building a life on that piece of land, raising a son, losing that son, losing everything except the ground beneath his feet. He told them about the transposed numbers, about the checks that had been cashed but applied to the wrong property, about the notices he'd never received because the county couldn't get his address right. He told them he was living in his truck, that he was 81 years old, that he didn't have anywhere else to go. He said he wasn't asking for pity, he was asking for what was right. Judge Holloway listened without expression. When Raymond finished, she looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Vanderhorn. She said she was inclined to consolidate the cases, Raymond's petition to void the sale and Eastbrook's complaint for trespassing. She said she wanted to see documentation from the county about the notification process. She said she was setting a status conference for February 22nd and a full hearing for March 10th. Then she looked at Raymond again and asked if he understood what she was saying. Raymond said yes, ma'am. He understood that he still didn't have a home and still didn't have a lawyer and still might end up owing $50,000 he'd never see in his lifetime. The judge's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. February was the longest month of Raymond's life. He'd found a church in Carthage that let him park in their lot overnight. The pastor, a man named Royce Blanchard, brought him coffee in the mornings and didn't ask questions. Some of the congregation took up a collection. It wasn't much, $340 and some grocery store gift cards, but it meant Raymond could eat and keep gas in the truck. He spent his days in the library preparing for the hearing, reading case law, typing his brief on public computers, one page at a time, learning words like constructive notice and due process and equitable redemption. He also learned about Eastbrook Holdings. The company had been incorporated in Delaware 3 years earlier. It had no employees, no physical office, no public-facing business. What it did have was a pattern. In the past 30 months, Eastbrook had purchased 17 properties across rural Texas, all at tax sales, all for pennies on the dollar. 7 of those properties had been tied up in litigation. 4 former owners had accepted buyouts, cash payments to drop their claims and walk away. 3 had lost in court. None of them had won. The registered agent, the one who'd refused Raymond's letter, was a company called Granite Peak Services. They handled registered agent duties for over 600 LLCs, all of them opaque, all of them designed to make it impossible to find the actual human beings behind the names. But Raymond kept digging, and in the 3rd week of February he found something. One of the properties Eastbrook had acquired, a small ranch outside Nacogdoches, had been the subject of a local news story. The former owner, a widow named Patris Kendall, had given an interview. She described receiving a visit from 2 men who'd offered to buy her property for $10,000, cash, no questions asked. She'd said no. 3 months later, she'd lost it at a tax sale to Eastbrook Holdings. Raymond called the reporter, a woman named Janine Coulter at the Nacogdoches Daily Sentinel. She called him back 2 hours later. What she told him changed everything. Janine had been investigating Eastbrook for 6 months. She'd traced the company through 3 layers of shell corporations to a real estate investment group based in Houston. The group was run by a man named Ross Beckett, a former mortgage broker who'd lost his license in 2015 after a fraud investigation. Beckett had never been charged, but he'd pivoted to a new business model: buying distressed properties, usually from elderly or unsophisticated owners, often by exploiting exactly the kind of clerical errors that had trapped Raymond. The group targeted counties with outdated systems. They monitored tax rolls for properties where the owner was over 70, where the assessed value was higher than the tax debt, where the notification address didn't match public records. They swooped in at auctions, bought properties for back taxes, and then resold them at market value, or held them as rentals, or simply flipped them to developers. It was legal, barely, and it was happening all over the state. Janine asked if Raymond would talk on the record. He said yes. She asked if she could come to Carthage and meet him. He said yes to that too. The story ran on March 3rd, 1 week before the hearing. It wasn't front-page news, not in Houston, not in Dallas, but it made waves in East Texas. The Carthage paper picked it up. A TV station in Tyler sent a crew. Suddenly, Raymond Stokes wasn't just an old man fighting for his home. He was a symbol of something larger, something people recognized, something that made them angry. The calls started coming. Other people who'd lost property in tax sales. Relatives of people who died before they could fight back. A law student at UT Austin who was writing her thesis on predatory property acquisition. A retired attorney in Longview named Everett Shaw who'd spent 30 years doing property law and was, in his words, too old and too ornery to sit by while they do this to a veteran. Shaw offered to represent Raymond pro bono. He filed an amended petition. He subpoenaed records from the county. He sent discovery requests to Eastbrook Holdings that made Vanderhorn, the Dallas lawyer, visibly uncomfortable. March 10th arrived. The courtroom was standing room only. Judge Holloway looked out at the crowd and didn't seem surprised. She'd read the newspaper stories. She'd seen the subpoenaed documents. She knew what was coming. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Shaw laid out the timeline with surgical precision. The data entry error, the misdirected notices, the payments applied to the wrong parcel, the auction held without any meaningful attempt to contact Raymond, the purchase by a company that specialized in exploiting exactly these failures. He presented affidavits from 3 other Eastbrook victims. He presented the deposition of a county clerk who admitted, under oath, that the notification system was not reliable and that errors happened more often than we'd like. He presented Raymond's military record, his Purple Heart, his 52 years on that property, his canceled checks, all 11 of them stretching back to 2013. And then he presented the offer. Eastbrook's attorney, it turned out, had approached Shaw 2 days before the hearing. They'd offered to drop their lawsuit, waive all claims, and return the property to Raymond. In exchange, Raymond would sign a non-disclosure agreement and release Eastbrook from any future liability. Shaw had declined on Raymond's behalf. Standing in that courtroom, he explained why. This wasn't about one old man and one piece of land, he said. This was about a system that allowed companies to profit from bureaucratic failures, a system that made it easier to take someone's home than to make sure they knew it was happening, a system that counted on people being too poor, too old, or too tired to fight back. Raymond Stokes wasn't too tired. Judge Holloway listened. She asked questions. She reviewed documents. She took a 45-minute recess that stretched to 2 hours. When she came back, her face gave nothing away. She ruled that the tax sale was void. The county, she said, had failed to meet its legal obligation to provide proper notice. The address error was not Raymond's fault. The payments he'd made, though misapplied, demonstrated his clear intent to remain current on his obligations. The sale to Eastbrook Holdings had been conducted without due process and was therefore invalid. She ordered the county to reinstate Raymond's ownership. She ordered Eastbrook to return the property, including any improvements they'd made, which amounted to changing the locks. She dismissed Eastbrook's trespassing lawsuit with prejudice, meaning it couldn't be refiled. And in a rare move, she ordered Eastbrook to pay Raymond's legal fees, which Shaw had documented at just under $15,000. But she wasn't finished. She said she was referring the county's tax sale procedures to the state controller's office for review. She said she was sending copies of the hearing transcript to the Texas Attorney General's office. She said that, while she couldn't undo what had happened to other property owners, she hoped this case would serve as a wake-up call. Then she looked at Raymond, still sitting at the plaintiff's table in his funeral suit. "Mr. Stokes," she said, "you may go home." Raymond didn't move. For a long moment he just sat there, like he wasn't sure the words were real. Shaw put a hand on his shoulder. The courtroom was silent. Then Raymond stood slowly and walked out of that building into the pale March sunlight. He was home by sunset. The house was cold. The electricity had been shut off. The pipes had frozen and burst in the back bathroom, leaving a stain on the floor that would never quite come out. But the pecan tree was still there. Della was still there beneath it. Raymond sat on the porch until dark. He didn't go inside. He just sat there, listening to the wind move through the branches, watching the stars come out one by one. The story might have ended there. In some ways it did. But in other ways it was just beginning. The newspaper coverage continued. The state controller's investigation expanded. By summer, 3 other counties had suspended their tax sale procedures pending review. Eastbrook Holdings quietly dissolved and reincorporated under a different name, but by then, the Attorney General's office had opened a formal inquiry. Ross Beckett, the man behind the shell companies, was never charged with a crime. The laws hadn't caught up to what he was doing, but his name was in the papers now, attached to stories of elderly veterans losing their homes. His new company struggled to operate in Texas. He moved to Arizona, then Nevada, then somewhere no one tracked. The law student at UT finished her thesis. It was picked up by a legal journal. A state representative cited it during a hearing on property tax reform. A bill was introduced that would require counties to verify notification addresses before conducting tax sales. It stalled in committee, but the conversation had started. Everett Shaw went back to retirement. He died 2 years later in his sleep, with no unfinished business. Pastor Royce Blanchard kept checking on Raymond every few weeks. They'd sit on the porch, not saying much. Sometimes Raymond would talk about Vietnam. Sometimes he'd talk about Della. Mostly they just watched the light change. Raymond got the electricity back on, fixed the pipes, patched the roof where it had started leaking. He was slower now, and he needed help with things he used to do himself, but he managed. He never did put up a fence, didn't see the point. The land was his, and everyone knew it. One evening, about a year after the hearing, a woman drove up the gravel road and parked near the barn. She was younger, maybe 50, with tired eyes and a stack of papers on her passenger seat. Her mother, she explained, had lost a house in Waco 3 years ago. Same pattern, same company more or less, same legal maze with no exit. She'd read about Raymond in the paper, driven 4 hours to ask if he knew anyone who could help. Raymond sat with her on the porch as the sun went down. He didn't have answers, not really. He was just an old man who'd gotten lucky, who'd found the right people at the right time, who'd lived long enough to see a judge say the words he needed to hear. But he gave her Everett Shaw's name, even though Shaw was gone, gave her Janine Coulter's number, gave her a copy of the thesis the law student had written, gave her coffee and a place to sit while she cried. When she left, she thanked him, said she didn't know if it would make a difference, but at least now she knew it was possible. Raymond watched her taillights disappear down the road. Then he went inside to the kitchen, where Della's photo still sat on the windowsill. He talked to her for a while, same as he did every morning, told her about the woman from Waco, told her about the way the light came through the pecan tree, told her he was tired but not finished. Not yet. He was asleep by 9. The house was quiet. The land stretched out in every direction, dark and still, the same land it had been for 50 years. The same land it would be long after Raymond was buried beside his wife under that old tree. Somewhere in Delaware, a new LLC was being registered. Somewhere in a county office, an address was being entered wrong. Somewhere an old woman was opening a letter she didn't understand. But on rural Route 6, in the house where Raymond Stokes had built his life, the porch light stayed on, just in case anyone else needed to find their way home.